Hi everyone, welcome and good evening. My name is Benjamin Quinn, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard University Division of Science, and the Harvard Library, one second. How's that? Loud enough? A bit more. Thank you all. All right, we're going to go with that, I think. Anyway, on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard University Division of Science, and the Harvard Library, I am excited and honored to be introducing this event with Dr. Temple Grandin, discussing her latest book, Visual Thinking: The Hidden Gifts of People Who Think in Pictures, Patterns, and Abstractions. Tonight's event is the latest installment in our Harvard Science Book Talk series, which works to bring the authors of recently published science literature to our Cambridge community and beyond. On October 24th, MIT's Peter Fisher will join us virtually for a discussion of his latest book, What is Dark Matter? And on November 10th, Peter Pesic, tutor emeritus at St. John's College in Santa Fe, will join us for a virtual presentation of his book, Sounding Bodies. For more information and our complete event calendar, visit harvard.com/events. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. One of us will be running around the theater with a mic as part of the Q&A, so please stay seated, raise your hand if you have a question, and one of us will get to you. We will not be holding a public signing after the conclusion of the event, but pre-signed stock is still for sale at the table outside of the theater, and the books you received as part of your bundle ticket should also be signed as well. Please also note that ASL interpreters are present for tonight's event, graciously provided by Partners Interpreting. We've set aside reserved seating in the front for anyone in need of this service or for a better view of the stage. There are some additional seats open, so do feel free to relocate if you are having a time accessing the program. Finally, I just want to give a big thank you to our partners at Harvard University, and thank you all for showing up and tuning in support of authors, publishers, indie bookselling, and especially for science. Now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Temple Grandin is a professor of animal science at Colorado State University and the author of the New York Times bestsellers Animals in Translation, Animals Make Us Human, The Autistic Brain, and Thinking in Pictures, which became an HBO movie starring Claire Danes. Dr. Grandin has been a pioneer in improving the welfare of farm animals, as well as an outspoken advocate for the autism community. Tonight, she has joined us for a discussion of her latest book, Visual Thinking. A quarter of a century after her memoir, Thinking in Pictures, forever changed how the world understood autism, Temple Grandin transforms our awareness of the different ways our brains are wired. Sylvia Nasser, author of A Beautiful Mind, calls visual thinking a delicious dish of provocative ideas and new research, served in clear, logical, fluid prose. And Steve Silverman, author of Neurotribes, writes, drawing on cutting-edge research, the history of science, recent discoveries in creativity and innovation, and her own lived experience, Grandin has created a powerful and provocative testament to the diverse coalition of minds we'll need to face the mounting pressures of the 21st century. We are so honored to be hosting this event tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Temple Grandin.
Great to be here. Got lots of things to talk about tonight. And when we start thinking about different ways that people think, one of the first steps is realizing that different kinds of thinking exist. I've done a lot of talks to big corporations, and I said, you've got to realize different thinking exists. Now, when I was in my 20s, I did not know that other people thought verbally. I simply did not know that. And being an extreme visual thinker helped me with my animal work, because animals do not think in verbal language. Well, I'm going to tell you how I figured out that other people didn't think in pictures. I was in my late 30s, and I've been talking to people about how they think. And if I ask you something like, think about your dog or think about your house, most people can see it because you're super familiar with it. But then I found the key, was asking about something that's out there. Everybody sees them and you don't own it. I said, think about a church steeple. How does that come into your mind? And when I think about that myself, they come up like, okay, 35 millimeter slides years ago, now PowerPoint slides. but they're specific images of specific churches. And then I can sort them into cathedral type or chapel type or New England type. But then one time at an autism conference, I asked a speech therapist who's a verbal thinker, and all she got was a pointy thing. 2 little lines like this. That was just a mind blower. That was my first inkling in my late 30s that the other people thought differently. So I started just talking to more and more people about how they think. I started to figure out that there's an object visualizer, though I didn't use that term, visual thinkers who think in pictures. Then there's a pattern thinker, your mathematician, and then a word thinker. And I'm going to be presenting research to show that these different kinds of thinking exist. And then a lot of people are mixtures of different kinds of thinking. But you get a kid that gets a label, it might be an extreme object visualizer like me, or maybe they're an extreme mathematician. So this just shows a shadow in a chute scaring cattle. My own shadow there with my iPhone there moving around. Animals notice little things that move, because things that move that shouldn't be there might be something dangerous out in the wild. Well, 5 years ago, I got a chance to go visit Cape Kennedy. Totally geeked out on this. I got to go on top of the roof of the vehicle assembly building, and then I found out later on I wasn't supposed to be on the roof, but it was really, really super cool to go on the roof. And then at 7 o'clock in the morning, we visited this launch pad. This is a 5-year-old picture. There's a rocket sitting on this same exact launch pad. And we were under there at 7 o'clock in the morning because we had to get to catch a flight like at 11 o'clock. And I saw a little motion that shouldn't be there on the stairway. And I watched a raccoon come down out of there, waddle down the steps, and go into the bushes. And then after I toured this, I found fueling equipment inside there that I don't really want a raccoon around, electric power boards, things like this. Nobody else knew he was there. But I saw this little tiny rapid motion. And then just the other day, coming up the escalator at the Denver airport, I saw the similar little rapid motion, but it was a cute little baby waving a balloon. You know, completely harmless. But it was the same kind of little rapid motion that shouldn't be there that I saw it through a window. And let's talk about seeing risk versus calculating risk. Engineers, the mathematicians, tend to calculate risk. And I have a whole chapter in visual thinking on disasters. When I found out why Fukushima burned up, I'm going, how could you do it? Well, they didn't see the water going in and drowning the electrically operated emergency cooling pump. I can't design a nuclear reactor, but all I know is if that pump and this electric motor doesn't work, I'm in so much trouble, it's not funny. And the mathematicians had done a perfect job of designing it to withstand the earthquake. Perfect job. Shook, everything was fine. 20 minutes later, the tsunami drowned it. They didn't see the water coming in over the seawall, and I know exactly what's going to happen to that pump when the water comes in over the seawall. And what I learned is the mathematical engineer didn't see it. It's like, how could you not see it? I see the water going in and busting out the doors, and then as I was reading about it, I found out some additional details that there was fish in the basement too. You know, that certainly wasn't going to do the pump any good. But let's look at how we think about things. Some people want to look at the diagrams to put furniture together. Other people would rather look at the words. And here's the kind of directions I hate, these kind of sequential directions. I'd rather look at the map. In fact, I like to look at the whole map before I go. Now in science, what I've been noticing in scientific papers, and I review a lot of scientific papers, fancier and fancier statistics. Really fancy statistics for simple little projects that when I did my PhD, we did a t-test or a chi-square on. So now we got to do fancy RStudio, this, something or other. That's the latest fancy thing. But then we don't go over the methods, because that's the part of the experiment where you see it. I remember reading a paper about pup retrieval in mama rats. Very fancy, big, expensive experiment. But they didn't tell me what they housed the mother rat in. It can totally change the behavior. Another paper, what did you feed your animals? How did you house them? What breed of pig did you use? It matters. and things this basic in the method section being left out. So I tear into the method section. I'll let somebody else work on the statistics. But the thing is, you need to be looking at both parts of the paper. Now, here's the methods disaster. There's a paper that I've referenced in visual thinking called The Devil's in the Details. And some major cancer research was wrecked because one lab used a magnetic stirrer and the other lab used a little Ferris wheel thing. And it totally changed the results. These little $300 mixing devices. It matters. It needs to be in the paper exactly what you used, what speed it was set at, what model number it was. Everything needs to be in there so somebody else can replicate the study. There's kind of 3 different ways of thinking, and then there's mixtures of thinking. I'm what's called an object visualizer. I think in photorealistic pictures. And the kinds of things I'm good at is mechanical stuff, art, photography, working with animals, and very high-end skilled trades. And we've got a huge issue today. People aren't getting replaced. I was just at an airport today. I think I'll leave out which airport it was at. But there were 4 people fixing the escalator that was all messed up. 3 older people with gray hair, 1 younger person. What's going to happen when the 3 people with the gray hair retire? This is the issue. They're not getting replaced. Then at another airport last week, they were fixing an escalator, and I check on this, and 2 of them, they were both gray. And I've been on some rather dicey elevators lately. A month ago, I went on an elevator, and the bellhop goes, "Oh, it skips that floor. We have to get that floor on the way down." Yeah, that's a month ago? Yes, you see, we need these infrastructures falling apart. We need these object visualizers that are really good at mechanical equipment. And the other thing when it comes to science, observation's part of science. I used to fight my advisor back in the 80s, and he said, observation's just anecdotal evidence. And I said, what's the Hubble Space Telescope? It's observation. And he'd just get mad. Now I can say about the James Webb Telescope. That still is observation. What's the control for the Hubble? Point it at the ground? Maybe it was a spy satellite in the past. So maybe that's the control for it. Okay, now the spatial visualizer is your mathematician. You're a degreed engineer in math, computer programming, engineering, chemistry, physics, music. Yep, I tried programming the exact same computer that Bill Gates had access to. Couldn't do it, he could. But I'm a big believer in exposing students to lots of different stuff so you can find out what they are good at. And the other thing I want to be talking about is complementary skills. We need the different kinds of thinkers working together because they can work together when they realize where the skills are complementary. And then, of course, you've got verbal thinkers, writers, sales and marketing, teachers, psychologists, lawyers. Yeah, don't put a marketing guy in charge of a big construction project. Yeah, especially if he's got a big ego and he won't listen to anybody. And then they build a plant that didn't have enough wastewater treatment and the town shut it down. That actually happened. What a mess that was. And now there's research that shows that this object visualizer, people like me, and then the visual spatial mind exist. And some of this research was published as late as 2002. Why didn't I find it? Because I didn't have the magic keyword object visualizer. And I finally discovered one of the papers in about 2012 when I was looking through the reference list of a boring paper on visual perception. And then I discovered the magic keyword, object visualizer. But there's a whole lot of research now, both older research and new research, that shows that the extreme object visualizer like me and the extreme visual spatial mathematician are kind of opposites. And then again, a lot of people are mixtures of the different ways of thinking. Now this slide I showed in my 2010 TED Talk. Yep, I've got a big visual thinking circuit in my head. There's another view of it right there. Okay, now when you're trying to take in information, let's say learn how a pump works or something like that, would you rather look at the pictures, that'd be me, or look at the written text? And then the more mathematically inclined tend to look at both. There's an article that just came out in the New York Times, I'm a visual thinker who hates graphic novels. Well, the reason why I hate them is I hate switching back and forth. That's what I don't like, is the switching back and forth. You see, because when I look at the diagrams, I look at the diagram really carefully, then I read the text. Okay, another interesting study that was much more recent was they had students, high school students in a specialty arts school, science students, and humanities students, which would be more verbal thinkers, do a project together in teams to create a planet. So the visual thinkers like me made fantastic planets, a crystalline world, a skyscraper world, palm trees and polar bear world. And the more mathematical science students just drew a sphere, kind of plain, described the atmosphere. The humanities students weren't sure what to do. They did splotchy stuff and they wrote words on it. Then they erased the words because they thought they weren't supposed to have words on it. But the thing that was interesting is the verbal thinkers didn't do very much planning of their projects. You see, verbal thinking, you tend to overgeneralize. Like people will say to me, what do I do about autistic kids in education? And I go, well, is it a 3-year-old for early intervention program, or is it an older individual? I mean, I need a little information, maybe age. Verbal thinkers tend to overgeneralize, where both the object visualizers and the more spatial mathematical visualizers bottom up, much more detail. Concepts are made with specific examples. Verbal thinkers tend to be much more top-down, and you leave out all of the detail. I'll give you an example. The whole 5G controversy with the altimeters on the airplanes and the problems with that. Well, I read some of the stuff the lobbyists put out, and it contained none of the important technical information that I found quite easily online. Why can our airplane fly over the Europe and everything's fine? And I know a little tiny bit of electronics, and I go, there's got to be something about frequency sharing that's different in Europe and here. I found the paper. I didn't understand some of the math, but I found the paper, and the frequency sharing here is different than Europe. That was never discussed in the paper. Let's discuss what the real problem is. I know there's some small airplanes right now in visual flight rules, and they're turning off the 5G at some of the small airports. But let's discuss the real problem. There is a problem. You see, this was an example of verbal thinkers overgeneralizing. It only took me about half an hour to find the paper. Wasn't that hard, and it's a scientific paper that explained that. And nobody discussed that. I just got out of Washington, D.C. Okay, we'll leave it at that. Okay, let's go back to the early patents. I had a really cool trip to the patent office just before COVID hit, and all the early patents were mechanical devices, the kinds of things that my kind of mind would be good at: grain harvesting equipment, sewing machines, the Colt pistol, the steamship, railroad stuff. These were all very clever mechanical devices. There's the sewing machine. And one of my favorite books when I was a child was about famous inventors. I just loved it, absolutely loved it. Okay, we don't make it anymore. In 2019, I went on a trip where I discovered there's a lot of important stuff we're not making. And it goes back to taking shop classes out of the schools. How about great big 3D printers? How about the state-of-the-art electronic chip-making machine, ASTML from Holland? Lots of need for skilled trades to build that thing. All right, let's get into my industry. My first inkling in 2019, before everything I did was shut down completely for a year, I went to this plant. Most of that equipment you see right there is from Holland, and some from Quebec, because they kept the skilled trades. You see, it goes back to what's going on in the schools. And the thing is, the visual thinking it takes to maybe invent things like this, all these conveyors, it's a different kind of thinking than verbal thinking or mathematical thinking. Here's the parachute for the Mars rover. She's taking a selfie of herself landing on Mars. I tracked down the vendors. The fabric came from the UK. It was woven on high-tech European looms, because I went through all the videos of the factory and I was getting the names off of the equipment. And then I went and looked up those web pages. Yeah, There's a problem. And then I went to a poultry plant, and the poultry plant equipment came over in 100 shipping containers. Now, I do most of my work in beef. Beef we actually know how to do still, but barely. The people are getting old. And then I went to the Steve Jobs Theater and the Apple building. Those structural glass walls are from Italy and Germany. See, the plumbing and the wiring, everything's hidden in those walls. And then the carbon fiber roof was from Dubai. And I stood in the middle of it screaming, we don't make it anymore. It was those 4 places. And then COVID came, and the book was the big COVID project. And I worked with my great co-writer, Betsy. I'd do the initial drafts. They'd be kind of disorganized. Betsy totally did her magic. You see, that was a verbal thinker and a visual thinker working together using the complementary skills. The worst thing we ever did was taking out all the hands-on classes out of the schools. Because if kids don't get exposed to things like art, sewing, playing musical instruments, woodworking, welding, theater, auto shop, or 3D printers. I signed all the books up in your physics lab, the makerspace. A lot of that stuff should be in the high schools. Because you've got kids now getting through high school without doing any hands-on things. You even had crocheting up there. You had sewing machines up there along with the 3D printers. I checked the whole place out before I signed the books. But kids are getting through school without doing any of that stuff. I was exposed to playing musical instruments. That didn't work very well for me. I was exposed to the same computer that Bill Gates was exposed to. He took off on it. I dropped the class. So I majored in psychology that didn't require as much math. We screen out a lot of the visual thinkers like me. I don't know if I could graduate from high school today. I still can't do algebra. And fortunately, Franklin Pierce College, when I went there in 1966, algebra was not the required class. There was matrices, probability, and statistics. I'm not saying eliminate math. Let's go with something less abstract. How about some business math? Yeah, let's have some business math. So if you start a shop, you can actually do it. One size doesn't fit all. And where you get the biggest problem where the same kinds of teaching doesn't work is the kind of the extreme kids. That's the big problem. I don't know how many parents have told me that their 8-year-old or their 10-year-old can look at like algebra problems and just do them in their head. And they won't let them do them in their head. They don't think the same way. And what's ending up happening to a lot of these kids is they're playing video games in the basement when they need to be fixing infrastructure. I wish the kids who are playing the video games were doing wonderful, fabulous video game industry jobs like programming. They're not doing that. That's not what's happening. And meanwhile, I've got an elevator that's skipping floors, aging people fixing escalators. Yep, not a good thing. Now let's just look at some statistics that we've got in the education chapter of the book. 60% of the community college students need math, mainly algebra. I talked to a girl that wanted to go to vet school. She's on a 3rd algebra class. I don't know a single veterinarian that uses abstract algebra or calculus. And let's replace it with some other practical math unless they're going the more math STEM track. But the kind of thinking that I do is a different kind of thinking. I worked out on these big projects, big Cargill plants, big complicated stuff. And there's the clever engineering department, and then there is the mathematical engineering department. You need both. Getting kids out on field trips. Well, there was a great field trip that a teacher did in New York. Took the kids out to just learn about parking meters. And then I saw the greatest thing with a 3-year-old at our building. A dad was showing a 3-year-old how the drain off our roof worked and how the water would go under this metal plate. And the kid's cleaning the leaves out so the water can go under the metal plate and run around and look at the other side of it. Now that's the most mundane thing. And the kid's learning something about that. That costs nothing to do. We got to get kids out there so they can discover what are they good at doing. Okay, 20% of the people that worked on my equipment built stuff for me, built some complicated devices, owned metal fabrication shops. About 20% of them were either autistic, dyslexic, or ADHD. And I went up and I visited a great dairy up in Quebec, and they had made some modifications to the milking parlor equipment that the manufacturer had adopted. And the guy says, I stop at the software. See, that's where you need the person to do the mechanical part, one kind of mind, and then you need the mathematician to do the software. And most of these people I worked with, they'd be flunking out of high school a day. One of them was saved by a single welding class. There was another guy, autistic, dyslexic, ADHD, single welding class. He is selling devices. I have to be vague because they're not publicly disclosed, but he's selling, fairly complicated mechanical devices all over the world. What would happen to some of our top innovators in the past today? Where would they go today? What would happen to Michelangelo today? 12 years old, dropped out of school. He was running around looking at all the great art that was being commissioned in the churches, and he grew up with stone cutting tools. That's exposure. You get exposure first and then mentoring. And the problem is today is kids are not getting exposed to enough stuff to kind of find out what they might be really good at. That's a really big problem. Steve Jobs bullied in school. I was bullied horribly in school. I was called all kinds of names, and I got kicked out of a large girls' school very close to here for throwing a book at a girl, called me a retard. And I ended up going to the Hampshire Country School, and you know what they did with me? They put me to work running the horse barn. So for 3 years, basically, I cleaned 9 stalls every day and I ran a horse barn. And I learned how to work. Also, horses are one of the few places where I was not bullied and not teased. Friends through shared interests. And some of the best times I had was sitting around talking about how to build stuff. I was on a flight about 2 months ago, sat next to a lady construction manager. We had a fabulous flight. A 2-hour conversation on concrete forming and problems with tilt-up warehouse construction, and how sometimes it might fall down rather than tilts up, it also falls down. But that was really a really good flight. And Einstein, no speech till age 3. He'd landed in an autism class today. What would happen to him today? Thomas Edison, another dropout from school. But he learned how to work, and he had somebody that mentored him and taught him how to be a telegraph operator. I had somebody that mentored me. They'd seen my drawings, and a man named Jim Uhl was starting a small construction company, and he seeked me out to design things for him. He was an important mentor. Elon Musk is autistic. Yeah, he's really had a great career. A Nobel Prize winner was 50% more likely to have an arts and crafts hobby compared to other scientists. That's another reason for keeping all of these classes in the schools. That's why we need it. Now, my grandfather, we used to live over on 983 Memorial Drive, we got pretty close to that, was a co-inventor of the autopilot for airplanes. MIT-trained mathematical engineer. Traditional route. And they worked with another guy named Haig Antronikian, who came up with this crazy idea for 3 little coils. Everybody else in aviation was trying to wire the plane's controls directly to the magnetic compass. And of course it went like this. That's what everybody else was trying to do. So they tinkered in the loft of a building in Springfield where they fixed trolley cars. Tinkered and tinkered and tinkered, and they finally got it to work. And unfortunately, in World War II, the stolen version was in every plane. That's the flux gate. The flux gate's the stolen version. The flux valve is the original version. The flux gate's not a very nice word in our family. And this is where they needed a verbal thinker. They needed a lawyer to prevent it from being stolen. Okay, so that's an example of where you need all the different kinds of minds. And then a lot of the shops I worked with, if they remained a very small metalworking shop, they didn't need somebody to run the office. One of the companies I worked with, the guy's wife did the business part, payroll, all of the, ordering materials, all that kind of stuff, all the business part of it. See, this is where you can have teams of people working together. Now let's look at the big food processing plants. Object visualizers like me, And a lot of the people that I worked with that barely graduated from high school were designing complicated equipment, laying out the entire factory. One guy had a one-semester course in computer-aided drafting, showed a homework assignment to the right engineering person at a plant, and got hired. See, in talking to corporations, I've told them we need to be changing the hiring practices because your best mechanic may not be the best person on interviewing. Maybe he needs to be showing off the cars that they rebuilt to the engineering department. He took the drawing to the engineering department, not to HR. And then your math thinkers, they were doing boilers, refrigeration. You know what's interesting? People I worked with never touched that stuff. We never touched anything to do with a snow load on the roof, wind load, power and water requirements. We didn't do that. See, this is where you need the two different minds, and what we're losing is what I call the clever engineering department. And they used to say, well, the stupid kids go to shop. Let me tell you, they're not stupid. It is a different type of intelligence. That's the thing that you got to understand. And there also is a chapter in the book on consciousness in animals. I've been reading a lot of that stuff. Now, if you think in pictures, it's easy to think, oh, a dog's conscious, because an animal is sensory-based. They're not word-based, they're sensory-based. But if you're an extreme verbal thinker and you only think in words, you might have a hard time imagining how the dog could be conscious. Yeah, I think some of this gets down to thinking, because I started looking at the departmental, academic department affiliation when people questioned animal consciousness. Psychology department would question it. Computer scientists did not. Let's put it that way. Okay, on writing the book, Betsy and I collaborated. I would do the rough drafts, associational, not that well organized, and Betsy would smooth it all out. That's a perfect example of different minds working together. And then we learned more and more about each other and how our thinking was different. I remember having a fascinating conversation with Betsy about the concept that a 3D printer is a mechanical device controlled by a computer. That's a concept she didn't understand. And she only understood it after she geeked out on like 25 3D printer videos. Then she finally understood that it's mechanical, controlled by a computer. Because we were discussing designing tools to go on the ends of robotic arms. And sometimes the best tool to go on a robotic arm in a factory does not copy how a person does it. Yeah, there's some stuff right now where people are trying to, they're barking up the wrong tree on it. Okay, let's look at architecture. There's some beautiful architecture. There's that weird building that looks like a Jenga tower. Okay, that's the aesthetic side of it. The engineer would just make a concrete box, like the astronaut headquarters at Cape Kennedy. It's a concrete box. So form and function to the engineer is the same. Where the creative person, form and function are different. I found an interesting study on chairs. And the creativity of a design was something separate than the function. There was one chair, it was a plywood chair. I thought it was awful. Then when I finally looked it up online, I found out it was in the Museum of Modern Art, and I thought it was a horrible chair, and I wouldn't want to sit on it. But this gets into the difference between the industrial design department, which has a lot more art classes, and the more mathematical sides of engineering. And you need to have both. Here are some tips for working with people that are different. If I was a computer, I would have a very small processor but tons of memory. Maybe an Intel 286 with a cloud for memory. And things like multitasking are hard. Some of these individuals need really clear instructions, like a pilot's checklist for things like shutting a cash drawer down at night. And I'm seeing too many kids getting too overprotected. We got to kind of stretch them outside the comfort zone, but give them choices. You don't throw them into a chaotic store during the holidays. And being vague doesn't work. Being vague doesn't work. But the people that I worked with, some of them that were definitely autistic, dyslexic, or ADHD, some of the most fun stuff we ever had was figuring out how to build stuff. So kind of, what's the ultimate goal of education? Where's a kid 20 years later? Yeah, hopefully they're in a career where they can do something constructive. I was doing this project right here that was shown in the HBO movie. And the HBO movie showed exactly how I think. It is accurate on showing how I think. I did that drawing in 1978. And I remember looking at that drawing and I'm going, a stupid person couldn't have done this drawing. One of the big motivators for me is I wanted to prove I wasn't stupid. That was an absolute huge motivator. Now this is the drawing that I used to sell Cargill. I designed the front end of all the Cargill beef plants, and I sent this drawing to Mr. Fielding. You might wonder why curves, because as they come on around the bend, they're going back to where they come from. That's a natural behavior for cattle. I had a very professional looking brochure they got. They basically got a 30-second wow, showing the stuff off. And then they got that picture, just showing things off. But you know what's happening right now? I've got equipment out there. I've had equipment out there now for 30 years, and all the shops are retiring out, and cattle have gotten fatter. And they're going to have to modify some of this equipment for the fat cattle. And there is one shop left, and they are price gouging. 5 times the price. Price gouging big time right now. Yeah, it's serious. And there's they built the working model of the dipping vat for the movie. I loved that all the way. It showed how I think. I just geeked out on that movie. That was another one of the pictures I sent to Cargill. But I didn't send it to HR. I would send stuff to like the plant manager, the engineering department. Bill Fielding was the head of the company. That's where I sent my portfolio. So they have an interview that he'd come in and show off the work. So what I'm finding when I talk to big corporations, some are really receptive. This other corporation goes, we can't change our interview process. Well, then you're not going to have anybody to fix your stuff. It's just that simple. So that is the book, and now we're going to do questions. I want to do a whole lot of questions. We're going to do a bunch of questions, and questions are my favorite part of it. So if nobody has any questions, I'm going to ask some of these people up in the front where I can hear what they say. Okay?
Oh, okay.
Have you considered other types of thinkers that could exist besides these 4? Are there any other types?
Yes, let's talk about Howard Gardner. He has things like kinesthetic, which is skills with sports and things like that, which I didn't cover. These were strictly the thinking, more looking at the engineering stuff. For engineering type of work, you've got my kind of mind, and then you've got the mathematical mind, and then, of course, you've got people that think in words. But I'm not covering something like somebody has beautiful coordination. That would be another skill. But I think the first step is realizing that different ways of problem solving exist, and we need to be looking at how we can use these as complementary skills, like Betsy and I working on the book. I learned more about verbal thinking talking to Betsy. I remember trying to explain leverage to her, and we were on like 3rd grade science website, same one. It's on my computer, she was on hers, trying to explain leverage, and she only understood it when it went back to something she had done, prying the lid off a paint can with a screwdriver. Then she could understand leverage. But showing her all these diagrams on little children's websites, that did not work. So that's another reason why we need hands-on things. She only understood the 3D printer being a mechanical device controlled by a computer after she watched tons of videos of it. Or she actually took that screwdriver and pried that lid off. And then I explained how the rim of the lid was the fulcrum, and that the blade of the screwdriver moved about 1/4 of an inch, and the handle might move several inches, and then she got it. Because she could relate it back to a real experience. Okay?
You talk like people are set, and I'm wondering, do you think people can change and evolve over time? Maybe they go from being a visual thinker to being more verbal and the like.
I think there's a certain amount of things that you can learn, but you're not going to take an extreme object visualizer like me and make me into a math specialist. That's not going to happen. I think a lot of it's innate skill. But I mean, there's a certain amount of stuff that Because I find in talking to more verbal people, let's say with the church steeple, and they get the line like this. There's a lot of people I can force it. I said, make you see it clearer. And then they might see two of them. I have to force them, get down to the, and some people can do that. But you're not gonna, when you get into the extremes, like the math genius, and someone's an extreme object visualizer like me, you're not gonna turn me into a math genius. But I find I can, now there's some people have aphantasia, and we discussed that in the book, where there's no visual thinking at all. And they're often very good at math and physics. There's some very, very interesting research. I mean, I during the lockdown, I spent hours online looking up papers and stuff, looking up all kinds of stuff.
Dr. Grandin, I have a question. You mentioned the U.S. and the U.K. and European approaches to getting hands-on experience with students. And a while back, I was talking with a British scientist, and I mentioned about China. And he said, oh, China is the construction shop of the world. And
Well, that's right. And the other thing is China limits video games. After they played them for an hour, the internet shuts down.
Yeah, but I'm very concerned about, they know that. They know.
Well, they know that, and the thing is, I'm very concerned.
So
and after I got out of the, like I went to the 2 pork plants first. This all happened in 2019. Then COVID locked me out of everything for over a year. I went to the 2 pork plants. Then I found out about the 100 shipping containers for the poultry plant. We built the building. And the refrigeration stuff we built. But all of that mechanical equipment that goes in there for poultry plant all came from Holland. It was beautiful equipment. You see, my animal welfare hat was screaming for joy, and my education hat was screaming and having a fit while I was looking at the name of the company on the equipment. And then I went out to the Steve Jobs Theater, and I'm going, oh, you've got to be kidding. See, there was 4 places in 1 year. And beef we still know how to do, but let me tell you, they're aging.
But I think you see what I'm saying about math. I mean, they're very good in math. I'm a professor, and I've taught a lot of Asian, Chinese.
Well, they're also very hard workers. I remember I had
it comes down to hard work.
well, yeah, and you have to do hard work, and I had a Chinese student in my class who was a very hard worker. And doing hard work, you see, learning how to work. See, a big problem I'm seeing now is working skills. So 3 years I went to an expensive boarding school to take care of a horse barn. But what I'm realizing is I learned how to work. I was responsible for those horses. So I fed them, I put them in a knot, and I cleaned the stalls. And I even repaired the stalls when the horse kicked the back of the barn out. I did everything except the financials. And work skills are different skills. And I have granddads coming up to me all the time, grandmoms and granddads come up to me all the time. They discover they're autistic when the kids get diagnosed. That's happening all the time. Engineering granddads, pharmacy granddads, skilled trades granddads, accountants, just all kinds of things.
Got a question up there.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Grandin. For someone who's a visual thinker, and math didn't make sense until the 10th grade when I took geometry.
Yep, I hear that pattern. Algebra's terrible, geometry's, I hear that pattern all the time.
I wonder where we are with our standardized tests, because I often think about what a nightmare the SAT was because they're testing
I failed the
on
SAT
verbal.
in math. I
Yeah.
totally trashed the SAT. and the
how do
thing is that we've got electric wires falling down in California. If the wind blows more than 45 miles an hour, they have to turn off the power because a big insulator will fall off those big Eiffel Tower things. And I wrote in the book how they break. I was right, because I found an article after the book had gone to the printer about this 59-cent bracket made in 1921 that holds the insulator to the crossbar, and it wiggles and it wears. That's exactly what happened.
Is
We're
there
going
any
to have
hope for
infrastructure fall apart if we don't do something about it. I just before COVID, I went to a conference at a hotel in Pittsburgh, and the main pipe had broken in the city, and we had brown crud coming out of the faucets, and we almost had to use porta potties for our conference. That was not nice.
thank you so much for being here and sharing how you see the world. I'm wondering, in terms of disinformation or this whole thing about, people not really understanding what is happening. I'm forgetting the word at the moment when people say, hey, this is all made up. Pardon? Fictitious, but it lies. So when we have this disinformation campaign, how is it that we know what's true? What's the perception or the way
Well,
that
I'm
we
a
should-
very, very good surfer, for one thing.
Yeah.
And I look at scientific papers, and that's one of the things I do. Also, when it comes to infrastructure stuff, when I'm out traveling, I look at it. I know something about construction, like bridges in Chicago with all the rebar showing on it. Yeah, I see that kind of stuff. That's not disinformation because I saw it. And when it comes to things like being the most inventive, I learned a long time ago there's only one way to stay ahead. And I learned this in the meat industry. Because I've worked for every major meat company on equipment, every single one of them. And normally when I would do a remodel job, I'd get what's called the as-built drawing, and then I had to figure out what I could tear out, what I could, and I had this one plant that made me sign 3 NDAs. They no longer exist anymore. Plus, give the as-builts back. Let me tell you, it's an obsolete pile of junk. There's only one way to stay ahead, and that's to stay ahead. And that's going to require a lot of work. You invent it faster than it can be ripped off. It's that simple. Yeah.
Got one up there.
Dr. Grandin, I wonder if you can comment on whether there's evidence of sex differences in the types of thinking. So, and then.
Oh, wait a minute, I can't hear you. Something about.
Is there evidence of sex differences in the types of thinking where one is preferentially exhibited in one sex versus the other, and whether there are
I mean, whether there's what the ratios are of the different types of thinking?
Exactly.
I'm going to I don't have any data on that, but I'm going to guess it's a third, I think it's pretty evenly split up. I don't have data on that, but just anecdotally, I would say that. Let's take a couple more questions.
We're all the way up here.
Yeah, we can go a little bit over the time because they told me to end it at 7:45, but we started late, so.
Are there any connections between your research with cattle and autism?
Well, the only thing, see, I'm a visual thinker. You see, animals do not think in verbal language. Animals are sensory-based thinkers. It's a smell world, a hearing world, tone of voice, a visual world. Now, you want a trippy piece of research I just read about? It's not in the book because it's brand new. Cornell University did a study with DTI imaging in a dog and found out the dog's nose has like an internet trunk line to the visual cortex. I'm going, smell pictures? Trippy. Try to imagine smell pictures. Dogs have them. And I was thinking about it. I was at a vet conference where I first presented about that research, and I was going up the escalator. I'm going, now if I was a dog and I sniffed the escalator, it's going to smell like metal and grease. Now if I put my head up like this, I'm going to smell some of the food and stuff they got at the trade show. But smell pictures. And then I see people yanking their dog away from the tree that it wants to smell. That's its life. It's sensory-based. You see, that's the thing. Not word-based. You can have thoughts without words. And interestingly enough, like Betsy's got a dog now she just loves. But before she had a dog, she had a hard time thinking about what a dog does. And I said, now Betsy, now watch your dog, what he does. Watch your dog. And well, again, it's like the screwdriver and watching the 3D printer. She has a dog and started really watching it. And she says, yeah, of course my dog thinks. But she had to have one to fully realize that.
We're in the top right.
Do you think that people are born with talent, or does it develop throughout life?
Okay, well, I think there's a certain amount of talent kids are born with. Like when I was in second grade, they had this little toy flute they called a recorder. And I could never figure out how to play the thing. And there's another kid that picks it up and plays it. And yes, and I had piano lessons, and that just didn't work. I think it's both innate talent and learning, because talent had to be developed. When I was a little kid, I would just draw the same horse heads over and over again, and Mother broadened my talent. You have to develop talent. You know, you get down to the whole nature-nurture thing, I think it's 50-50. But you're not going to make me an algebra specialist. That's just not going to happen.
The clever arrangement of equations on a page can help mathematical thinking. So I think there's not a clear division between mathematics and visualization.
Well, you see, the rotation of figures. When I was younger, I used to be a lot better at that because it's spatial. See, in mathematics, it's a pattern. It's spatial. See, where I remember specific photos, like I got better and better and better at my thinking is like let's start with cattle handling facilities. The first thing I did is I went to every feed yard in Arizona. There was about 20 of them, and I handled cattle there. You see, that's a typical bottom-up approach, just like artificial intelligence, just like training a computer to diagnose melanoma. You show it a whole lot of specific examples. That was a mind blower for me, discovering that. So I'd go to all these places, and then I basically took all the good ideas and put them together and chucked out the bad bits and then invented a few new bits. But it was a bottom-up approach. And I just kind of instinctually did that. I took lots of pictures at the different places, and then I figured out certain things in layout that just don't work.
So I have a quick question about design, right? So if you had the opportunity to redesign how a society is built, like what would you change first?
Oh, I'm going to just put the hands-on classes back in the schools. You put the hands-on class up there in that physics lab where I signed those books. That stuff needs to be in the high schools. Sewing machines, crocheting, I looked at the whole thing. A ton of different 3D printers that are not that expensive. I'd put a few welding things in there too. But the thing is if you put these things back in the schools, then the kids can find that they're good at this stuff. When I was at DCD, at Dedham Country Day School, I took embroidery. I had a toy sewing machine in 4th grade that actually sewed. Little hand cranker, Singer Sew Handy, super cool. I did woodworking and art. And then I spent hours out in my yard tinkering with bird kites. And that's in my book, Calling All Minds, for children's things. You see, I was exposed to that stuff. See, I'm a big believer in getting kids out and expose them to a whole bunch of stuff. Music, theater. I didn't care about acting in the play, but I loved making costumes. And I made costumes for the 3rd grade play on my Singer Sew Handy. That's making things. But you see, kids are growing up today totally removed from the world of the practical. I had a girl in my class, and they have to do a scale drawing in my class, that had never used a ruler in her life to measure anything. She had never measured, that was last year, had never measured anything with a ruler. Yeah, I think that's a problem. You see, we really do. Like I said in the TED Talk over 10 years ago, we really do need all the different kinds of minds, and we probably have to end it, and I'll be happy to stay up here and talk to people. You can come down and talk to me. That's just fine. Take pictures if you want. Okay, thank you all for coming.